We're talking about methods of living with and communicating uncertainty, absolutely building on the themes from this morning and taking you just a little bit more deeper with lots of different experiences on this panel today. So I'm really thrilled to welcome and introduce our speakers and our moderator. Apoorva Mandavilli is a reporter for the New York Times with a strong focus on science and global health. She's part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2021 for her coverage of the pandemic, and Apoorva will be our moderator for today. We also have Veniece Miller joining us. Veniece is a program coordinator with the Harvard Law School's Election Law Clinic. She grew up here in Colorado, which is how I got introduced to her. She just recently graduated from CU Boulder with her degree in political science. She is very passionate about public service, has a lot of deep roots in community organizing and rural issues here in the state, and really is a strong voice for how do we get young people engaged and involved. So I'm really excited to have Veniece here. Andy Revkin is joining us. He is the founding director for the Initiative on Communication, Innovation, and Impact at the Columbia Climate School. He is a leading environmental journalist, has been for decades. He's been covering everything through this lens of science and society. He's been covering climate change for so long. I'm a huge admirer of the work that he's done and thrilled to have Andy with us. And we also have Kate Sweeny, who's a professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside, as well as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. And she has a really big, strong focus on the idea of how do we deal with waiting for important news and dealing with that uncertainty in our lives, and is really bringing that psychology angle. I was talking with someone last night, Kate, who was really thrilled to hear your perspective today and bringing in that kind of psychology piece to this conversation. So I'm excited to hear what you all have in store and look forward to the next 50-some minutes of conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And Apoorva, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you for having me. As we all know, we've been living with a ton of uncertainty in the last few years of all kinds, political, public health, climate change, all kinds of things. And I hope that in this conversation, we'll learn a little bit about what that feels like, but also talk a little bit about how we live with that. So I'm really excited to have these particular panelists here to really walk us through that. Andy, I want to begin with you. Can you give us a sort of quick recap of the insanely uncertain time we've lived through in the last few years with all of the different aspects that I just mentioned, politics, science, public health, everything, really. Did we lose Andy here? Okay, well, I'm going to go to you, Kate. I would like to hear from you. What do you think it must have been like for all of us? What was it like for Americans to be dealing with all of this for the last couple of years and feeling so much uncertainty?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time to be a researcher of uncertainty, obviously, as we've had this kind of intense collective period of just not knowing what was coming next, really, in many cases, not knowing even how to proceed with our own days. We know from lots of research, including mine, that uncertainty is really unpleasant psychologically. We're kind of not built or wired, however you want to think about it, to cope very well with not knowing. That's a really good thing, actually, for humans, because if we were really comfortable with uncertainty, we would fail to resolve it, and that would be bad for us in lots of ways. But that uncertainty, or the discomfort that kind of motivates the resolution of uncertainty, is really uncomfortable when we're experiencing it. So, I guess one message is, if you've been feeling a little uncomfortable in the last few years, you're certainly not alone, and there's good evidence for why it feels that way. I can talk over the course of this conversation about lots of different ways people have coped or might be able to cope, but maybe I'll just say at the outset that we're just not very good at coping with uncertainty. And so, again, if you feel like you've been kind of flailing about trying to find some kind of steady center during this period of time, again, you're not alone. It's just really a challenging kind of stress to deal with. So I'll leave it there for now, but lots of tips in the coming hour.
Great. Actually, if we can stay with you for just 1 minute, can you give us a sort of quick primer of all of your study on the different kinds of uncertainty? I'm sure uncertainty is itself sort of an uncertain concept. So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, great. So it's a really broad concept, and it's, the concept of uncertainty is something that psychology has been interested in for a really long time. But what I discovered as I started digging into my own research career is that we kind of missed a piece of uncertainty that I think we all know and hate, which is when we're uncertain about something really specific and it's something consequential. So, you have a job interview and you're uncertain as to whether you'll get that job, or you have to undergo a biopsy and you're uncertain how that will turn out. You take a professional exam and you're not sure if you'll pass. That kind of waiting period of not knowing and having very little control over our future seems to be a really challenging combination of states of mind. And so that's mostly where my research has focused. I've studied would-be lawyers taking the bar exam in California. I've studied professors and researchers waiting. I've studied professors and researchers waiting for jobs and manuscript decisions and grant decisions. I've studied lots of student experiences with uncertainty and even women undergoing biopsies at a local hospital. So we've really kind of covered the territory when it comes to stressful waiting periods.
Thank you for that. Andy, welcome back. I wanted to hear from you. You are sort of uniquely positioned as a former journalist, but also an expert in this sort of media communication. How you think we did? What was it like? How did it play out? All of these uncertain issues that we dealt with: climate change, public health, politics, all of that. And how do you think the media dealt with that?
It's been quite a time. That group hug that Kate was just talking about. Oh, sorry if my hold on, I'm still here. Hold on, there we go. I'm on Starlink up here in rural Maine, Wabanaki territory, so we have too many trees and I'm not going to cut them down yet. So that's
your internet connection is uncertain.
Yes, it is. And these moments happen. So anyway, no, it's been horrible, and I think it's been particularly horrible for journalism. Where you and I live. I still am a journalist. I write all the time, and I run these webcasts. And through COVID, climate, and the internet itself, the infodemic, as some call it, and then add in a Ukraine invasion and the uncertainty that comes with for whether we're going to actually have a nuclear war sometime. And you have a real royal mess. And the media are awful at uncertainty. We are craving the front page thought. The newsroom, when there was a print time at the New York Times, every afternoon around 3:00, the editors would go into the front room, the front page room meeting. And the science editor, this is before COVID and everything, would come in. I'd be pitching a story to her about some new clarity around the Greenland's ice sheet, and she's there, going in there competing with the sports results and some terrible accident that happened on the thruway and the stock market and political wrangling, and people look at that and go, well, isn't that? They'll either say, didn't we already know that, or the incremental value of knowing it a little bit better isn't news. And then today, with what we faced with COVID, particularly the first year there was, I think the media are so desperate to latch on to the first little bit of clarity. We jump from one model to the next, the London model, and each one was hyped without the qualifiers being in the foreground. So you end up with what I call a whiplash effect. I actually made it into a hashtag long before COVID. Whiplash effect. Search for that. And I wrote about it in the New York Times in 2008. That if we cover every development in an incremental, complex, consequential situation as news, the reader gets, all they get is this kind of wagging, kind of back and forth coverage. Oh, you told us the Greenland ice sheet was about to collapse last week, and now you're saying, well, it's a little bit more complicated. And the models were saying one thing about COVID and then the next. So I think media models are way behind in trying to build a more trusted a relationship that readers can more fully understand and embrace around when we're in a tough time like this, when a normal news structure of an article actually impedes reader understanding, public understanding of the bigger dimensions of something that's unfolding. So I think that's the crux of the challenge we face, along with just the never-ending story aspect of trying to unravel a story that's really complex, and it's still happening with the source of the COVID of SARS-CoV-2, and it's kind of like we're at a really. I hope the media will learn some lessons, and I'm glad we're having this discussion.
That was a little bit harsh, Andy.
On myself as much as anyone
yes,
else.
no, I'm joking. I think it's
No,
it's a well-deserved criticism, and I do have some thoughts about though. But I think we should get to that. I want to hear from Veniece first on how your generation experienced the pandemic. You know, for some of us, like there's a whole sort of pre-internet life, and then a life of sort of knowing some things for certain. And I feel like for younger people, there's been just so much uncertainty, and so much uncertainty bombarded at you by social media and so many different sources of information. So I want to hear a little bit about what that's been like for young people.
Yeah, I think when I think about my generation, I think of kind of like a generation of uncertainty in a lot of ways. When you think about the past 20, 22 years of the things that have happened, and most recently COVID, there's been a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty in a lot of ways, I think, is all that we've ever known, which I think is pretty interesting. So I was in college when COVID hit, and I had peers that dropped out. I had peers that decided to continue, peers that moved home, really took a lot of different directions with their life, right? Because kind of this one streamlined version of what do you do when you graduate? For a lot of people, you go to college or you start working. It kind of changed a little bit. And for a lot of people, that was so overwhelming. And it was also taxing on people's mental health. And in so many ways, I think for us, we didn't even know going out what we were getting our degree for, what the job market was going to look like in a few years. And a lot of different kind of things going on. And so, you know, I think something that has been a effect of this uncertainty that we've experienced, especially with COVID being a very prominent one of those things, is kind of this culture of doomism with young people, kind of this idea, you know, that things are so bad that why care about anything? And I kind of like to push back on that narrative a little bit, because I just, in my own experiences, coming together with other like-minded young people in my community, you know, there are ways to make change and to continue working to improve systems in society. And I'm a big proponent of my generation doing those things. And I think that there are so many amazing, talented people that are doing that. But I think it's about almost reframing the narrative a little bit of uncertainty to opportunity, because uncertainty is probably one of the most constants that we're going to have in our life. And so it may be about kind of learning how to, and I'm very interested to hear from my co-panelists about kind of how to manage those things and to turn it into something that can be useful.
Thank you. I mean, I think all generations lived through some kind of uncertainty, and I know, I grew up in India, and I remember when I was growing up, we lived with the threat of nuclear Armageddon between the U.S. and the USSR. But the difference was that we were not bombarded with information in quite the same way, and a lot of the information came filtered through adults, through people we trusted, and we could turn that source of information off for actually a good part of the day, and really only think about it, somewhere in the backs of our minds. But for you guys, it must be just relentless. And Kate, I want to hear from you what that does to people's mental health, to have that kind of uncertainty and worry be a sort of relentless part of your everyday life.
Yeah, it essentially serves as a chronic stressor, which we know is not great for us. We have a system in our bodies to respond to stress, and it's really good that we have that. But on the other hand, if it's on all the time, it doesn't work as efficiently, and it breaks us down physically and certainly mentally as well. One of the things that I've been interested in is the way that uncertainty and worry affects our sleep, which then becomes kind of a pathway to all kinds of negative outcomes. We just don't function as well if we're not sleeping well and not sleeping enough. And I think we probably all know the feeling of, turning that light off and just not being able to turn the thoughts off with it, or waking up at 3 a.m. and just being beset by, all the most scary things in our lives and in the world. So there's lots of sort of pathways through which the stress of uncertainty gets under the skin, is every health psychologist's favorite phrase. And so, and again, you don't even have to go that far to be concerned about our physical health. Our mental health is wearing as well. And that's in itself, of course, a huge burden. So we certainly have seen some spikes in depression and anxiety, particularly among young people, but in general during the pandemic. I think there's good news there too. It seems like we've been more resilient to this kind of unimaginable period of uncertainty and adjustment than maybe we might have predicted. At this point, at least in the general population, depression and anxiety are basically back to pre-pandemic levels, and they have been for quite a while. So depends a little which study you look at and how you measure it. But I do think there are some real stories of resilience in this period of time, but certainly the uncertainty has gotten to most of us as well.
Thank you. I mean, Andy, you were talking about how people get that information that causes them to be stressful and stressed out. And a lot of people do get their information from journalists. And I think your point about people, journalists not being excellent at pointing out exactly what's known, what's not known, how is this really incremental, or sort of overhyping things. That's a really good one. I do want to offer this other perspective, though, where I saw a lot of non-science journalists writing about things that they were not trained to write about. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I mean, at least, at the Times, everybody was a COVID journalist at one point. Even the travel desk was writing about COVID. And I think they made a valiant effort to try and understand. But, I would think that for somebody like that, it's sort of natural to believe everything that the CDC may tell you, or the FDA may tell you, or even the White House may say about science, and not realize that you might actually be actively being duped and lied to and manipulated. I've got to think that must be just, and also just the complexity of the science that you're dealing with, to be able to say what is new. I'm sure you saw this too. I saw a lot of articles about scientific concepts in virology that were being written about as if they were brand new, but actually this is all old hat for anybody who writes about viruses. So there's also that sort of element. So how do you think that sort of works when you have the number of outlets that are out there, the number of sort of digital outlets where people can get their information, and then there's all the social media sort of posts and self-anointed experts, and how do people even begin to sort of figure out what's credible, and how can journalists really help to make that distinction of why they're credible versus something else?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. Obviously, I think there's two fronts. One is not necessarily the responsibility of the journalists, which is really shifting how we teach from a very early age. There are things we don't have to learn anymore, like the multiplication tables, because that I grew up learning. There are things that are new, new skills, new ways of looking at the world that kids are not yet normalized in understanding. One is media literacy. There's a woman a professor at University of Rhode Island, Renee Hobbs, who I've had on my webcast 2 or 3 times. She teaches propaganda literacy. And she really opened my eyes to understanding that, we tend to think of propaganda as like this dark thing, but it's actually, the roots of that word are in the positive. It was spreading the faith. It was spreading the faith. It was the church propaganda. It was for the people. But having literacy, understanding when you're being buffeted with signals, whether it's in advertising or social media or the media, that there are ways that you as a kid and as an adult can have your own sort of little warning signs click on. And I've been writing about this recently. I just did a piece on my Substack blog yesterday, how to deal with headlines that seem too good to be true. Whether on this actually was a bit of a critique of my former employer, the New York Times. It was about the morality police. the abolishment of the morality police in Iran. But it was the same thing with headlines all over the place on Antarctic glaciers that are collapsing or whatever. And I try to offer some insights in how you as a news consumer can keep your own sanity by looking for keywords or looking for little things that imply a story was overly simplified. But the media literacy, making that a fundamental early part of education, I think is at least a start. And newsrooms, I think if we, I actually came up with these warning labels for social media particularly. It's not possible to not write about a new study of the COVID virus, but maybe there's a visual aid, like a green, yellow, orange color code that says, this is early knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in your face. You will hear about it all over the place tonight on social media, but here we're writing about it too, but we're signaling right away. This is one study. I have this, I wrote about this at the Times, single study syndrome, where the media and pundits latch onto what's new because it's new and interesting without signaling this is one little fragment of the new knowledge in a complex question. So finding ways to signal that, whether it's color coding or something, I think is something that media can do. So those are two things.
Yeah, I think saying up front, as you said, that this is preliminary, this is one study, this was done in mice, whatever you need to say to be able to signal to people that it's preliminary, that will definitely go.
But I'm just going to add one tiny little additional thing. Scientists who I talk to about how to be interviewed, if you equivocate or if you stress that this is new knowledge, sometimes the journalist, not the New York Times, but others, will just skip to the more quotable source. So that's a constant tension at the interface between the public and something new or controversial in science. We gravitate to conflict, we gravitate to more dramatic voices. And so it's not, there's no quick, easy fix here.
Right. And journalists are trying to make things more exciting and clickable, because that's the only way to survive in the sort of overcrowded media landscape right now. So, Andy, I want to leave with one more point that I think we should come back to, which is you talked about media literacy, but there's also the element of sort of scientific literacy among consumers themselves, and the fact that we don't actually teach in this country how to think about science, that it's not a fixed thing. We may talk about specific things like climate change or evolution or, things like that, but we don't talk about everything we know is sort of mutable, and it's this is what we know right now, and there's a hypothesis, and you test it, and then you go forward. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, how we get to that point. And Veniece, how where do you get your information? Where do the people that in your age group get information, and how should it be packaged so that you know what to trust and what not to trust? Do you even trust legacy media?
I think that's an interesting question. And I may not be the best spokesperson for my entire generation in general, because I do listen or read legacy media. I listen to it, especially through podcasts, different methods. But I know a lot of my peers, including family members, cousins, friends, get their information from TikTok or Twitter. And so, and I don't think that that's something that's new to anybody. Scrolling through those different feeds, it automatically comes up. So if it's interesting to you, you'll listen to it. And so I think, when you and Andy are talking about the information saturated world, I absolutely think that it's on both ends. It's on the consumer end and the end of the producer. And so I think that becomes particularly hard because you get exhausted from just sheer amount of news and articles that are coming at you constantly. And there's a point where you just need to shut it off. You don't want to hear about this thing that's happening anymore. And so I think in some ways, like that oversaturation makes people my age withdraw. They don't want to be a part of it. They don't want to hear about it anymore. It's not accessible to them in a way that makes it like manageable. And and as like the voting election person here, I think that translates to a lot of reasons why young people don't engage in things politically. They don't think that they have enough knowledge or the expertise, or they just don't know that their voice is just as they get one vote, just like every other person, no matter the age, if they're over 18. And so I think kind of making things more manageable, and not getting your information from every single, whether you're scrolling through Instagram or Facebook or different social media platforms. It's too much for one person to handle. It really is. Yeah.
I mean, it's my job to look at that stuff, and it's too much for me most days. So I completely sympathize. Kate, so I want to not just talk about all these problems we have. Clearly, we have problems, and it's not sustainable for us to keep going in this way where, we have all this uncertainty and we are not actually coping with it in the right way. So what are some things people can do? What are some things experts can do, but also the average person can do to live with this kind of uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, as an uncertainty expert, I'm not sure I'm better at coping with it than anyone else. But yeah, I think that, from my perspective, I think a lot about worry. So that's kind of the mental and emotional space that kind of ends up plaguing us when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And, worry can, as with everything else I've talked about so far, be really helpful to us. There are times when we should be worried about something coming down the road. Maybe there's a threat impending. When it was the early days of COVID, that might have looked a lot like being sort of protective of yourself and your family, not leaving the house, washing your hands a lot. Maybe nowadays that means getting that most recent booster. But there's lots of ways, as you've all discussed, that we're feeling uncertain now and worried about what might be coming in the future. Very often there's nothing we can do about it. And so, if there is something you feel like you can do, sometimes taking that action can be really, it can be a salve for that worry, for that feeling of uncertainty. When you're stuck, though, and I think that's often where we find ourselves, one of the things that my lab has looked at quite a bit is the benefits of finding really good distractions. And that can be kind of an out, but sometimes we need that out. We don't need to be engaged. As you said, Veniece, we don't need to be engaged at all times. It's absolutely overwhelming. And so when we can't sleep, when we need to get ourselves kind of back on track, one of the ways we can do that is by finding what researchers call a flow state, which is this kind of form of exquisite distraction where you are so in it with the activity that you're doing, you're in the zone, you really can't think of anything else. The time flies by, all that other stuff just kind of disappears when flow is at its best. And there's lots more to say about that. It's kind of complex how that state occurs and how we maintain it. But if you think about something that you can't do if you need to leave the house soon, that's probably a flow activity for you. That might be a puzzle, it might be a game, it might be part of your work if you're lucky. And those are the kind of things you really want to reach for when you're feeling overwhelmed. I saw people doing this very naturally at the outset of the pandemic with the bread baking craze and the absolute inability to find a puzzle online because they had all sold out. I think people were, without knowing what to call it, kind of looking for these ways of just disappearing into something pleasurable.
That's so interesting. I was indulging in that myself, and I didn't know that's what it was called. People asked me a lot, how did you avoid burnout? And honestly, it was because I was, I think, watching Korean dramas every night and teaching myself Korean. It's a whole other world, not even English, nothing to do with the pandemic. And it really kept my sanity. So that's
it. You really want it to be somewhat challenging, which it sounds like you found that as well. It's, zoning out in front of Netflix or, whatever streaming service of your choice is not always the best way. But if you can find that way to engage and have it be more active, it may not be kind of natural. You might think you just need to relax, but it's actually that challenge that tends to be more helpful in these moments.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Andy, I want to ask you about, how can we improve the way people process media? I mean, we were talking a little bit ago about educating the public about media literacy and about scientific literacy, but if they're not taught that in school, what are some other ways that we can actually improve that those skills in people?
Well, one thing that I've been doing, I came to Columbia 3 years ago to build this initiative on communication and sustainability, and as COVID lockdown happened, I started a public webcast series, and one track that just emerged organically was what I call Thriving Online. thriving online. And so now it's like 35, 40 episodes, and they're all stacked as a playlist. And they're there as a public resource, just they give people little insights from people like Renee Hobbs I talked about earlier, the propaganda literacy person. But I just think the more we can spill our expertise out, including expertise on what to do when you don't know something, and the more scientists can convey, as we were saying earlier, the normalcy of uncertainty, the flavors of uncertainty, as Kate was talking about too. Just so uncertainty literacy is something that's as important as media literacy. I remember like 15 years ago in the journal Nature, there was some article on do we need to go to risk school, meaning humanity, people, Homo sapiens, and I thought it raised some really great points about that relates again to how most of our learning, most of our understanding of science is around discovery, not around the areas where science illuminates what we not only don't know, but can't know in some cases. So that feels, again, like an opportunity. And that's, any university, any individual scientist who wants to brave being on social media can sort of convey that, the unknown isn't just about making it known. Sometimes it's just the mystery. And the more we can convey that comfort factor, I think the better off we'll all be. This deals with this morning's discussion got into that pretty well too.
One of the things, I heard a lot while covering the pandemic from public health agencies and experts is that they were struggling with wanting to tell people that the information was uncertain or that it would become more certain down the line, but also not wanting people to panic. And so this need to give people easy, pat answers to what's going on. So, how do you strike that balance? How do you get to a point where you're sort of giving them just enough information and just enough uncertainty, but not too much? And Kate and Veniece, if you have thoughts about this, please feel free to jump in too.
Well, I just put in the chat, and maybe it can get shared with the audience. There's a guy at Columbia who runs the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. He works with emergency management people all the time. And he said, even at that level, people tend to have this instinct when things are really complex and the world's deeply uncertain and things are consequential. A lot of people just crave more information. And what he said to me in an early webcast was, it's just the opposite. You need to figure out how to create your own filters, how to as things are flowing at you, whether it's from a colleague or social media, you have to make these little judgments, little micro judgments. Is this useful to me? As opposed to intriguing or fearful. And that's just another kind of a training process. I thought I love what he said. It's just, I had printed it out at one point and showed it to people. Like, learn how to be your own filter is really crucial.
Mm.
Yeah, and I would just say on top of that, I think, it does the reader a disservice by trying to make things simple sometimes. I mean, I just think for me, like having always grown up kind of in this environment, it's not something that's necessarily new to me and my peers. And so I think that nuance and that complexity is a strength. I think when we look at our reader as, like less than or not able to maybe understand, that's contributing to the problem, right? That's feeding into these like norms and biases that we have. But I think like right now, especially, like the public is craving just, everybody's waving a flag saying, I have all the answers, like, please come to me and I'll make things better. And in reality, we all know as humans, that's not true. There's not a green flag that's going to solve all our problems. It's nuanced and complex. And I think we need to lean into that notion.
I completely agree. I mean, I think, during the pandemic, I wrote some stories that I would never have dreamed would be on the front page of the paper or that would be widely read. Incredibly complex things. Like I wrote a whole article about this thing called the cycle threshold value of the PCR test. you could not have convinced me that that would actually be read. And it was really widely read. And it really, I saw that over and over, that people were hungry for more information. They wanted complexity. They wanted to understand the nuance. And as you said, that paternalistic attitude of you can't handle it, that I think actually backfired, because it's so this idea that something's being kept from me. What else are you hiding? What else are you lying to me about? And I think it actually made things worse. So yeah, absolutely agree. There's a really interesting question here that, I'd love for any of you to jump into, which is, are there characteristics of people who are enervated or energized by uncertainty? And if so, does that give us clues as to how to present information?
There's a woman, Michelle Wucker, wrote a really good book about this. It's like she also wrote the book The Gray Rhino, about, the black swan is the idea of these uncertain big events, and she talks about gray rhinos, which are hiding in plain sight. Anyway, she wrote a book recently that starts with you doing your own self-assessment, like what is my reaction to fear or to uncertainty. So if you're a decision maker, if you're running a company, if you're whatever, having a better sense of your own, where do you fit in that landscape you were just describing, Apoorva? Or the question was,
you'll need to unlock your iPhone first.
Anyway, it's a good start.
Kate, I want to hear from you about how you think. Yeah, I mean, are there sort of specific kinds of people who actually love uncertainty and complexity?
We haven't found them yet. I think, uncertainty is pretty challenging for everyone. At least as far as my field is concerned, there are folks who are more or less comfortable with uncertainty, but I wouldn't say that anyone loves it. Having said that, I think it provides an opportunity for, growth and sort of self-reflection in terms of understanding your reactions to uncertainty, sort of as Andy said. And if you, as I do, find yourself being very uncomfortable with uncertainty, that's, one could say, to spin it positively, an opportunity to kind of to confront that discomfort and recognize, as Veniece said, it's always uncertain. There will always be things we don't know. There will always be complexities that are beyond our grasp. And so, kind of practicing coping with that uncertainty is a skill that will serve you your entire life. So it's not, I guess, that I would say we have found that folks really love uncertainty. No flavor of person really enjoys it, but it's certainly a chance to grow as a person.
I also think just like about uncertainty in general, about, because of uncertainty, different things that have come to pass. It's almost like you can't get from point A to point C without point B being uncertainty. And I think Andy was touching on this. But in these moments of grave, whether that's like on a collective or an individual level, like with COVID or something else, you saw communities rallying together to help each other. You saw people sacrificing. You saw families coming together. You saw, I think, in moments of uncertainty, humanity can really shine through. Not always, but it is something that is worth noting as a positive.
I love that.
That is worth noting as a positive.
I love that positive take. That's great. Actually, I was struck by something you said earlier, which is that, this kind of uncertainty and this communication that comes at you really has a political impact, and people of your generation may just sort of tune out and not decide to engage. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you think are some solutions to getting around that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting. I did my thesis in college looking at what forms of civic engagement, if any, impacted people in their political participation for the rest of their life. And it was really interesting, and I won't get into the weeds of it. But one point was, the tangible actions of a person, whether that be going out and volunteering in a local nonprofit, or holding like a mock election, or doing something like very hands-on, had statistical significance. Whereas having kind of this top-down these are the 3 branches of government, learn this, this, and this. It did not have that same impact. And obviously there's a lot of nuances to that. I'm very grossly simplifying it. But I think it confirmed my own experience when I look at kind of how I was able to engage from a young age. It was from like a community standpoint. I got socialized into volunteering, into doing all of these like kind of outward facing things, which in turn, like inwardly, gave me this efficacy in my ability to be a part of a community, to influence a community, to impact a community, and help in whatever small way that could be, if even just for myself. And so I think that, you know, like I said, there's such a, and the problem is like, I relate to it, right? I can totally see where people are coming from when they're like, things are so terrible right now. Like, look at climate change, look at like declining democracy across the world, look at all of these different things. Like, what can I, a little person from Western rural Colorado, do about any of that, you know? And so that's valid, but I think, you know, and I think Kate was talking about this earlier, but I think I'm one of those people that's like, well, what can I do? You know, and so I think maybe if it's not even helping anybody, it's helping me a little bit, just feel like I'm doing something. And so when I think about, you know, getting young people engaged and participating, it's through these small little incremental things, and they start young. A young person, I don't have the stat exactly, but I can share it later. They're if they don't vote within like the first 2 election cycles of past when they turn 18, their chances of voting go way down. And so it really starts then. If it starts then, you most likely will have a lifelong voter, and in turn participator. And so I think that just shows how important it is to engage young, and doing things that, you know, you can do, like whether that be, I'm good at writing, I can write an op-ed in my local newspaper, or you know what, I like to volunteer, I'm going to like go to an old folks home, or an animal shelter, or I can even just share out my perspective in a meeting as somebody who maybe wouldn't be called on. So I think that there's just little things that we can do that may bring other people to the table, and kind of push them to be a part of the table, or take away the table altogether, I think I've heard too. So.
I like that. I have a very quick follow-up for you, which is, if you miss that window of engagement at a very young age, then do people remain non-voters their whole life?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can share that article I'm referring to. I apologize, can't recall it off the top of my head. But that is the gist of it, that once those 2 election cycles, your chances of voting later on in life go drastically down.
Kate, when Veniece was talking, I was thinking that some of what she was describing was a feeling of powerlessness, and that when people feel empowered, they can move forward and do things. And can you talk about that, and how much of the last decade, or the last 3 years even, of uncertainty is fueled by that feeling of, I can't do anything about this? Is that of powerlessness that can be paralyzing?
Yeah, you're exactly right. You know, one of the things that I've focused a lot on, as I alluded to briefly earlier, is the really challenging combination of not knowing what's coming. So that's the uncertainty piece, and not being able to do anything about it. So that's the powerlessness piece. Mm-hmm. You know, and in my research, that's generally, I've found that intersection in these more acute moments of uncertainty, you know, waiting for that biopsy result, where you're just waiting, you're stuck, you don't know, and you can't change the future. On the other hand, with things like COVID-19 or sort of the current political environment, we're not stuck entirely. I mean, there are things we can do to make the world a better place or just to make our own lives a better place. And so one of the things that I have found, even in those moments of true kind of stuckness, is if people do find some way to grab a little bit of control back from the universe, say you're waiting for that biopsy result, you can't change the outcome, but maybe you can become very familiar with your insurance policies and your work's leave policies and make sure you have ways to get your kids to school, that sort of thing. Even those kinds of preparative actions can make people feel a little bit reassured that they're not completely just at the whim of the universe. And again, in these more existential kind of long-term sorts of uncertain periods, there's lots of opportunities to take action, exactly as Veniece said. So I think those moments are opportunities for global change and societal change. But even if it only makes you feel better, it's still probably worth it.
Right. Andy, are there things the media can do to sort of build this feeling of, being empowered, other than just not overhyping things and making sure that we say when things are uncertain? What can journalists do to make the situation a bit better?
One thing I can't remember if I wrote about this. One thing I noted that I think is very valuable was when the Atlantic Monthly and New York Times, when some media started to become a portal, not just for stories, which, as we were saying earlier, aren't really a good fit for complex unfolding situations, where they switched to providing data, to become a reliable source of data on COVID-19 infection rates, the maps that the Times and the Atlantic Monthly, with its partners, put together, I think created a new sense of a value of media. Actually, I tweeted at one point, I thought that the public service Pulitzer should go to those efforts more than to like a story. I mean, Ed Young deserved his Pulitzer for the great narrative writing he did about COVID-19 for the Atlantic, but I think the public service offered by the media, just shifting what they think their product is. The product is reader trust and engagement for impact on society, and if that means becoming a portal for data as well as narrative, then I think that's something we could do.
In fact, that actually the public service Pulitzer for the Times, a big component of the submission was the data part of
good.
COVID.
See,
yeah,
there you go.
COVID dashboard. I think you're absolutely right that did turn out to be, a big part of how people sort of processed everything that was coming at them. But at what point does it become too much? Because I've also heard criticism that, we never tally numbers for things like flu or even HIV in this very public way. And I actually heard one expert say that everything went downhill after Johns Hopkins started its COVID dashboard, which seems a little bit of an extreme statement to me. But I do wonder about at what point does too much information become not empowering, but just confusing, and then people just tune out?
Well, I just think that gets back to starting with what do people need. This could be a problem, particularly for national media, because, in Maine here, I go to the website of the Ellsworth American and the Bangor Daily News, and that's finding ways for regional media, who are usually the most trusted, most engaged, to have the facility to have that connection with their audiences. Might be a way to do better, because otherwise it is kind of overwhelming. So I think the specificity to the needs regionally can do that. On Twitter, there's been some great examples with everyone's yelling about Twitter, but I did several episodes and wrote about them recently because they've made the Twitter can be used as a tool for real-time disaster response and preparedness work. It's actually a great interface because it's real time. It's 6,000 tweets a second globally, and it creates a landscape of what people are seeing that emergency managers can build on. So that could be very local. So there's innumerable possibilities, but they all get back to that idea of what does that person need in that context at that time right now.
Okay, we're actually about 10 minutes before we have to stop. So what I'd like to do actually is go to each panelist, and if you can say sort of your closing thoughts, what surprised you during this conversation, and what parting thoughts do you have for our viewers? Kate, I want to begin with you.
Oh, no pressure. You know what? One thing I've been thinking a bit about, I guess, and this is just as a person in society as well as an uncertainty researcher, is I think we might have thought that by this point in the pandemic, let's say specifically, that we would all feel, some sense of reassurance. At least it may not be going away, but at least a lot of the uncertainty that we all faced, especially in that first year to 18 months, has passed. So why are we still here, right, talking about all this uncertainty that we're feeling? And I don't know. I think that there are open questions there, but I wonder if this experience that we all had kind of collectively, globally, attuned us a little to the other uncertainties that we're facing. And so that now we sort of notice more that there are all these other uncertainties with climate change, with global unrest, with political unrest. And so if that's true, that's discouraging, because that suggests that we're kind of maybe feeling the effects of these uncertainties more than we were when we were in our blissful ignorance pre-COVID, feeling like everything was quite predictable and like things would be the way they always had been. I think it only brings into sharper focus the need for good coping strategies in these moments of really challenging uncertainty. And again, it's not some of the things that my lab has studied feel very kind of small and trite almost in the face of the global level problems that we're talking about here. But at the end of the day, we're all individuals who have to sleep at night and go to work and take care of our families. And so, I think things like finding those flow states that kind of get your brain a little unhooked from the constant sources of uncertainty. Mindfulness meditation proves very helpful. Everyone gets tired of being told to meditate, but we know it's incredibly effective as a stress reducer. It also helps us to kind of be less reactive to the intermittent feelings of uncertainty that we have. And then, kind of managing our thoughts. So when we feel worries, identifying them as such and asking whether we can do anything about it. And if the answer is yes, do the thing. And if the answer is no, turn to those more kind of emotion mitigating options and keep paying attention as much as you can, but unhook when you can as well.
Yeah, I mean, I highly recommend for unhooking in the flow, watching something in a foreign language, because the process of reading subtitles engages you just enough, but not too much. Veniece, closing thoughts?
Yeah, well, I've learned so much today from both Kate and Andy. It's super helpful tools, especially, I will say, the flow state going forward. This was a good call out for me to maybe get a hobby outside of work. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. No, I think kind of as I ponder and think about what we've been discussing this past hour, I think something super interesting about this conversation is that uncertainty, like while felt on a personal level, is very much a collective thing. And I think sometimes communication of that feeling can be super healing and helpful for others. I know for myself, when I'm feeling a certain way, when I say it out loud in a room of people, there's like a lot of other people that are like, oh my gosh, I was feeling the same way, but I just didn't know how to say it. And so I think being able to communicate that and say, hey, this is where I'm at, can be super helpful for knowing that you're not alone and helping other people know that they're not alone. And so I think that kind of going forward, being able to communicate that can be healing for a lot of people. I think going forward, kind of as we uncovered this feeling of powerlessness of people, and especially this upcoming generation, I think some of the tools that we've talked about of, going in on a local level, being able to change maybe things that are more manageable to you, and kind of reframing the inevitability of uncertainty. And I'm not trying to say, oh, we need to make everything positive. I don't think that at all. But I think there has to be a level of acceptance in moving forward and working with what we have. And so those are some of the things I'm going to continue thinking about past this discussion.
I have to imagine if you talk about your feelings and other people say, I've experienced the same thing, and you sort of have this sort of mutual easing of people say, I've experienced the same thing, and you sort of have this sort of mutual easing of the discomfort, that can also be empowering in a way, because you help somebody by speaking up, right? Andy, your thoughts?
I keep circling back to something I learned from a climate adaptation expert, Susie Moser, who I've known for like forever. And she's been working for several years on what she calls fostering the adaptive mind. If people Google for Adaptive Mind Project and her last name Moser, they find this sort of synthesis of the idea. And it's because we're in such a point, and again, this is not unique, but it feels really unusual in our time, the scope of change, the layers and dimensions of change. An adaptive mind is this is, I'm reading from her little thing, a set of propensities, leadership skills, and capacities that allow an individual embedded in social networks and institutions to respond with agility, creativity, and resolve to constant change, surprises, rapid shifts, anticipatory fear, and the like. And I think that the more she talks, the more that concept comes to the fore, the better it will all be. We need it in newsrooms, we need it in classrooms, and politicians could do well to put it in the foreground too, as opposed to sometimes getting in front of a camera and saying things to, because of that fear that people will reject.
Well,
Oh, and I froze.
Okay, you're back.
There we go. There's not enough satellites in the sky, Elon. Let's put up a few more. So anyway, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, as the moderator, I will say I've learned a ton from all of you today. I love the idea of sort of the flow state. I liked everything, Veniece, that you said about the sort of positive take on how you can make people feel empowered and how to sort of impart that communication in a way that actually makes a difference. And Andy, I take your criticism of media very seriously, and I at least will try to do better, even if nobody else, no other journalists are actually listening. So on that note, Kristen, back to you.